Thank you very much, Don, and welcome everyone. This is our third and final plenary session and on global perspectives on service learning and teacher education. And as an international center, our work, our community are intended to span the globe. And in planning the conference, we felt it was very important, actually very imperative, to feature some non-US perspectives on this. And where we know that, as we mentioned throughout the day, that service learning is gaining much traction across the globe, not only in tertiary or higher education, but also in primary and secondary educational systems in different countries. And I think this has a lot of implications for how we advance teacher education and how we prepare our future teachers. Although, there are some core elements that define service learning does look different in different communities, in different cultures and contexts, and in different countries. And especially when we consider the cultural, historical, political, religious, and geographic issues across these national borders, the complexities of service learning and the unique and nuanced features of service learning across these different countries really come to the fore. And we are very fortunate today to have with us three panelists who have traveled far to join us at this conference and to participate in this panel this afternoon. And they represent three national and regional perspectives on service learning, and we are very honored to have them with us. And before I introduce our panelists, I'd just like to quickly describe the structure. So we're going to have each panelist present for about 12-15 minutes. And we've asked each panelist to address three issues: the state of service learning in primary, secondary, and higher education systems in their country and region, and other countries in their region; the role of service learning in the preparation and professional support of teachers; and the role of community in service learning. And then following each of their presentations, I may ask a question or two, depending on the time we have, and then open up for some conversation with all of you. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Starting us on the panel will be Dr. Nadine Peterson from the University of Johannesburg, South Africa. Nadine has taught at secondary school for 9 years before she joined Rand Afrikaans University in 1997 as a tutor coordinator, and then at the University of Johannesburg as a faculty member in education. She's a specialist in service learning and adult education, has published widely in service learning field, and we're very delighted that she could join us here today. Also on the panelist is Rajesh Majumdar from the Doon School in Dehradun, India. And Rajesh is a physics teacher and head of science at the Doon School and has taught at Doon since 2005. He started his teaching career in 1993 in reputed residential schools of India, gaining experience with different curricula, including the IB, the International Baccalaureate. And he has quite a range of interests, including collecting pencils. We'll have to talk about that. Coins and paper currency. He also enjoys traveling and motorbike expeditions. And you may recall he was one of our honorable mention recipients at the awards this afternoon. And also joining the panel is Carol Ma from Lingnan University in Hong Kong. Ma Hock Ka, affectionately known as Carol, is currently an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Social Policy and the assistant director in the Office of Service Learning at Lingnan University in Hong Kong. She was awarded a W.T. Chan Fellowship to study and practice service learning at UCLA, and is currently a visiting scholar at NERCI, the New England Resource Center for Higher Education in Boston, Massachusetts. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel. Welcome. So I'd like to invite Dr. Peterson to begin the discussion, and welcome, Dr. Peterson.
Thank you, Andy. I just said to Andy a little bit earlier on that I've been shifting the slides around so much, so I'm likely to skip out on one. My presentation, the paper one, doesn't quite look the same as the one I have up for you, so please excuse me for that. And thank you to Don for inviting me to be part, and the board to be part of this panel. From a South African perspective, all things South African, our map, our flag, the distinctive grade 5, the big 5, etc., just to orient ourselves as to where we're talking about, where South Africa is located. I'm sure everybody knows that. But in thinking about how we would talk about this panel presentation and where we would locate South Africa and the region and service learning within South Africa, is thinking about where do we come from. So to a large extent, and I will use 3 terms interchangeably for the purposes of this presentation: community engagement, service learning, and community service. And I will explain why the issues in the presentation, why the issues with language and how we name things are one of the problems we're dealing with. But everybody knows about our divided past. So how do we move to nation building from a deeply divided past characterized by apartheid? Deep divisions in the country, deep divisions within communities, etc. And to how do we find common ground with each other? And community engagement and service learning within that is one of the ways in which we've done that. So how do we begin to build a nation? Our democracy is relatively new, from 1994, so we're still a very young democracy, and we needed to find a way in which to build the nation using the structures that we had at our disposal, one of which was education. So we've managed to do it quite successfully, I think, through uniting through sports events, Rugby World Cup, etc., and we really see the nation coming together, but it lasts for a very short while. And then very soon the cracks show again. So we needed to find a much more sustainable way of thinking about how we build the nation. And education legislation seemed to have been the answer, both in the schooling sector as well as for higher education. So step 1, how do we introduce community service, and this is where the first of the terms come in, into the South African school system. With the advent of democracy, we had a revised curriculum for schools. So the very foundations upon which education was built in the country at schooling sectors underwent a lot of change. Part of this was the introduction of life orientation, which is a subject that deals with life in society. And the phase is mostly in the high school where I'm going to be concentrating. It includes this compulsory community service project of about 10 hours with a focus on citizenship education. Excuse my voice, I think the aircon is doing something to it. Human rights, democracy, all the kind of things we associate with nation building. So here's an example, for instance, of a theme and topics that you would address in life orientation. So very clear democracy and human rights, about building a nation. Some of the topics: discrimination, xenophobia, all the issues we struggle with as a country. Diversity, human trafficking, HIV and AIDS, and so forth. Mostly social and environmental issues. Now, although we call it community service, just have a look at the kind of guidelines that students work within these community service projects. For me, they sound very similar to service learning projects. There's a connection with the community and issues in the curriculum itself. It's meeting a need in consultation with the community, writing proposals about how to plan and implement it, but also reflection for students on their learning and their involvement within that. So although the term is community service, and so there isn't really service learning in the school curriculum, my argument is that this is the beginnings thereof, and it's up to us to take this baton forward. So I'm going to give you a few pictures. I had to unfortunately just use my daughter and my colleague's daughter, Khadija. So some of the projects that students would be involved in, for instance, outreach work at an old age home. But they also learn about social issues, neglect of the aged, etc. in South African society. Some of the activities they would be involved in, and a portfolio that speaks to their reflection and their learning. And then my daughter making literacy and numeracy booklets for a primary school, and then handing it over to the school principal. So still very much more than just simple outreach, really about addressing curriculum issues and real life issues in the community. Step 2, the most important part for me at the moment is what do we do in higher education? And here I want to present a kind of timeline for the activities that we've been involved in. So where did it all start? Again, soon after the first democratic election, the white paper on higher education in 1997. It really set an agenda for the transformation of higher education. It was about how do we begin to change a racially divided higher education sector to include community engagement of some kind, so engagement with community that helps to build a nation. And one of the first initiatives was this program to explore the potential of community service in higher education with the Ford Foundation grant, in fact. So it was your money that helped kickstart it through the Joint Education Trust, and it was the launch of the Community Higher Education Service Partnerships. And this was an initiative that was aimed at taking people from various higher education institutions and putting them through a kind of training program around service learning in order to build capacity. And I'm sure you can see some of the faces there, Bob Bringle, Tim Stanton, Kathy Stacey, some of the original people who worked with us in the training, with some of the South African people who were involved in that initial training. And that was a very important jumpstart for service learning within the higher education sector. The conversations went to a slightly different level around about 2006, where there was an international conference, and here's where the ground sort of gets a little bit muddied with different terminology, when the overriding term became that of community engagement, which in and of itself is not problematic if one thinks of service learning as a form of community engagement, but when people don't have clarity about terminology and they start mixing up the terms, this is where the difficulty comes in. In any case, we had then, the lady in the middle was Naledi Pandor, and she was our then Minister of Higher Education, and she was really the first Minister of Higher Education to publicly advocate for community engagement and specifically for service learning as part of the higher education agenda. So she moved the conversation in a national forum forward for thinking about how higher education should not always be just about teaching and research, but that it should be integrated with community engagement. So that was really a seminal point for us. And then obviously some publications that came out of those fora for thinking about grounding the field at that point. Then also the initial research. So I think in a sense we've been very good about documenting where we've come from in these kind of publications, not for profit. So these were distributed freely to every higher education institution that was involved in their own training or just for personal use purposes. And so a number of essays about lessons learned in the early years of the chess partnerships. So from the various disciplines, and I think there were about 12 or 15. Eventually, chess, obviously, Ford Foundation money ran out, so there was no longer any money to keep it going, and it was handed over to the Council for Higher Education, which is like a statutory body that deals with higher education matters in the country. They took the conversation one step further and invited a number of high-profile people to start having conversations. And when I talk about high profile, I talk about people at DVC level. So they tried to move the conversation beyond just practitioners, but really towards people who could make policy changes, who could make really fundamental shifts within institutions. That was very useful, and it resulted in this particular publication, Community Engagement in South African Higher Education. What was useful about this is people began to pull apart the notion of community engagement. What does it mean? Excuse me, what form it takes? How do we begin to document best practice, which I think, excuse me, was what was needed at this point in the field. Then came the launch later that year of an organization known as SAISEF, the South African Higher Education Higher Education Community Engagement Forum. And it's the first national body of its kind where every single higher education institution in the country is represented. So both private and public institutions, as well as places like Monash, etc., who operate in the university. So there's no real difference in terms of, there's a lot of collaboration across institutions in the country, maybe because we're so small and we only have 22 institutions. And SAISEF, this was the first time people really came together. So although it was community engagement, service learning at this point had a really strong voice. up until this point, service learning had almost been on the sidelines. Other forms of community engagement, community-based learning, internships, all those kinds of community engagement initiatives were really strong. And this kind of projected service learning into center stage within the country. So it was an initiative that service learning protagonists like myself saw as an important step. Then at this point, some of us who had been working for the previous 10 years in the field of service learning decided that we weren't going to allow the service learning movement to be hijacked and the gains we had made to be hijacked by this new idea called community engagement, and that we had to firmly ground service learning as a field, as a discipline, as a practice and a pedagogy and a philosophy on its own in higher education. And we called together a colloquium, and we were very interested to see who would come. And what was so amazing was that people who had literally been working in the field in service learning for the last 10 years were at the colloquium. And we called that Innovations for the Next Decade, because we thought we'd already had 10 years of being sidelined. We know, thank you so much. We didn't want to be in that space of being sidelined any longer, and service learning protagonists kind of wanted to claim their rightful space. Oh gosh, okay. There's the picture of them 10 years down the line, all the service learning advocates. Then the National Research Foundation put together money for the first time again in the country's history in 2011, research grants specifically around looking at community engagement and also looking at how communities' voices feature in this. Step 3, service learning and teacher education. Again, we fiddle and we fiddle. I don't think South Africans give policy enough time to germinate before we change again. Every time we get a new Minister of Higher Education, we throw the baby out with the bathwater and we start all over again. For us, the good thing is that we have a new qualifications framework for teacher education, and we're revising our teacher education qualifications. And for the first time in the country's history in teacher education, service learning is mentioned explicitly as a form of experiential learning. So we see this as a step forward. We have an existing text for service learning in teacher education. It's a very broad introductory text, and we've decided we're including now, because of the new developments in the field, we're now going to include a chapter on the teacher in service of society, and it will have a service learning focus. We're planning a new scholarly text because, well, your books are expensive, and we want our own frameworks. So this is our new textbook that we're planning. It will probably come out at the end of this year, where we're taking a very critical theoretical stance for service learning. So we deliberately framed the book in a particular way, and that will be those chapters. So how do you engage with your community in a very theoretical way? We don't want altruism, we don't want philanthropy. It's got to be about critical educational and social frameworks. And this will be a text that has a number of chapters from various higher education institutions, and you can see there are 3 that are teacher education focused, so we're really pushing the mark with teacher education and service learning here. Now, my concluding, I'm almost done, Andy. Step 4, the neglected element in South Africa is really the role of community in service learning. I must admit, very few projects focus explicitly on the role of the community. That is changing with the NRF, the National Research Foundation funding, and the projects that are being worked on, but it's also a working group. So in this national organization that we have teaching and learning, etc., but there's a community and partnerships group. So the kind of people who have an interest in that are really working very hard to enhance those kind of ideas. Where to from here? Our problem is our struggle with concepts in the higher education context. We take on concepts without fully understanding what they mean. We have a slew of concepts, some of them like work-integrated learning, internships, community service, etc. And the overarching term in the higher education context is that of community engagement. However, people put the things on the same level, and that is our biggest problem. So at the moment, because service learning is seen as this great thing now, everybody wants to jump on the bandwagon. They're jumping on the bandwagon without really fully understanding the difference between things like service learning, work integrated learning, etc. Okay, I think I'm done.
Thank you very, very much. Very insightful and thoughtful, and congratulations on the great work that's been happening in South Africa. Excellent.
Wow, it is really great to be here amongst all of you, and I never imagined that I will be speaking to all of you, coming from so far, and especially at Duke University. It is a great honor for me, and I have heard a lot in the past 2 days about service learning and where do you stand in the US education system and what other countries and other universities are doing in teacher education. But what I'm going to tell you today now is a very, very small step that we have taken in India. Last year I visited, I had a chance and privilege to visit California State University under the Teaching Excellence and Achievement Program, which is run by IRX. And I got this opportunity to learn this new concept of service learning. The idea struck me a lot because back in India, we do a lot of community service. And especially my school does a large number of community service programs. There are many projects. And I found, I realized that this idea of service learning can be merged with the community service that we do, and it can definitely change the learning skills and the teaching strategies in my school at least. So we started, and one of my colleagues in the department, Mr. Swami, he was also interested, and we took a very, very small step towards teacher training. So I would like to start from the numbers actually. Now in India, numbers are huge. We have 28 states, although it is less than what you have in US, but it is still in that small area, 28 states. 22 languages listed in the Constitution. These are only languages. There are 800 plus dialects. So you move 4 miles from one place, the language changes, and the taste of water and food changes. So we have such a demography. Now you can understand. 1.3 billion population, and 28 states have right to frame curriculum, and there are religious freedom to open schools. So anybody can open school. So we have missionary schools, we have schools run by Muslims as madrasas, and we have schools run by Hindu institutions. And so it is a heterogeneous society, as you all know. But we always have believed, and I will tell you, there is a saying in Sanskrit that Vidya Dadati Vinayam, and the meaning is education gives humility. So if humility is not imbibed, then the person is not educated. This we have always believed. And in the National Policy of Education, which was framed in 1968, there is a 6th principle. There are more than 8 principles, and the 6th principle specifically says that the school and the community should be brought closer through suitable programs of mutual service and support. Work experience and national service, including participation in meaningful and challenging programs of community service and national reconstruction, should accordingly become an integral part of education. Emphasis in these programs should be self-help, character formation, and on developing a sense of social commitment. So this is specifically there in the National Policy of Education, which so this can become the guiding principle for service learning in India. And later in 1986, the National Policy of Education was again reframed, but this principle was intact. So I did a little bit of research how to link service learning into our educational policy, and this is I found something. Now let us go a step further and see the numbers once again in a different perspective. From primary to secondary, there are 237 million students all around the country. I am excluding the private school students. You can add on around 60 million students here, which can definitely, so the number will be around 300 million students. And the teachers, if you see, it is around 5.5 million. So if you take a ratio, it is 1:45. That's the number. And I have included many of the assistant teachers and helpers who just help in public schools. And that's why the number is 5.5 million. Otherwise, it will be less than that. So the ratio is actually 1:60. So in this context, how do you introduce the idea of service learning? So it is a big challenge. It is a huge challenge. The federal role, the central government, we call it central government, but I put the word federal here so that you can relate well to it. There is a Ministry of Human Resource Development. It's the government of India. It works through National Council of Educational Research and Training to implement school education. We have national boards, 2 national boards for class 10th and 12th. One is CBSE, Central Board of Secondary Education, which is totally under government control, central government control. And the second one is Council for Indian School Certificate Examination, which was actually an offshoot after independence. It is a new board was formed. One earlier, the metrics, 10th grades and 12th grades, they were all under Cambridge system. So this is actually an offshoot of that Cambridge board. And there are 28 states, so 28 state boards. So this is the structure of education system from primary to secondary. Now the aspects of service learning which are embedded into CBSE as well as CISCE are the work experience which is embedded into the system, and socially useful productive work and community service. And so there is a component, there is an aspect of service learning which is inbuilt. And you will also see that it is a compulsory activity for students in both the national boards to get a minimum grade to pass the national examinations. So it is sort of compulsory that students have to get involved into community service. Things are going on, students are doing, teachers are getting involved into social activities, but there is lack of reflection. And so the service learning is not there fully. But fortunately, there is a lot of scope. Role of service learning in teacher education. What I think that it can develop higher order thinking skills. For example, creative and divergent thinking, how children learn differently, how children learn with less resources. This can be studied. If I tell you an example, that our students go to village school and they teach village children mathematics. They regularly visit the nearby slum schools as well as village schools. Now when they teach, they also learn that students who have less resources, how do they learn the same concepts that they have learned in other schools where there are a lot of resources. So there is a different way to learn the same concepts in a different scenario. And I tell you, many students have told me this when they come back after community service. They have told me that we never knew that the concept that you have told us in physics can be learned in a different way. And this they have done once they actually teach it. The second is the constructivist teaching. And I think it organizes teachers and students' knowledge and understanding, built on what they know, facilitate information processing, and also facilitate deep thinking through elaboration. And here I would like to give one example that our students do in our school. After some time, I will show you some of the pictures and videos also, and you will be able to see more than what I am telling you now. There is a project called microfinance. 4 students of grade 12th, they took up this project of microfinance, and they financed some of the work that village women do, and that can make them economically free. They can uplift themselves. They can grow, they can send their children to school. So this microfinance project was a huge learning for those students. And when they came back to the school, they found that they know much more of accounting. They know much more about business studies that they study. They also know about the economics and the demography of that village. So once they reflect on that, they have much more knowledge from where they started. And the third thing is making thinking processes explicit, which can be done through reflection in real life situations. It shows a lot of collaboration. What a lot of collaboration can happen. It can encourage curiosity, exploration and investigation. It demands a lot of student responsibility and encourage various performance-based competencies. And there are several other projects in our school which makes this skill or these skills for the students to learn. We have water harvesting. We have English conversation classes for village students. And there is another ecology drive, and that is in collaboration that Swami did this year with the Groton School. I think some of you might be knowing Groton School near Boston. So those students visited us, and there was a service learning program done in one of the national parks. So I wanted to give you a picture of the Indian education system in which the aspects of service learning are embedded. There is a lot of scope, but very few people actually know about service learning in India. And we have taken a small step to train teachers in India across the country rather, to tell them that this is a very powerful tool, very powerful pedagogical skill, which can be incorporated. Unfortunately, I think the time's less, so I wanted to show you a video which can give you a more clearer picture of what we have been doing. But maybe if I get some time later on, I can show it to you. Thank you.
Hi everybody, it is my honor to be here to share with you about service learning in Asia. So we have to think about why service learning happened in Asia, right? So what I'm going to talk about is why does service learning emerge in Asia? And then I will give you some example of service learning in different countries in Asia. And then we'll talk about service learning in Hong Kong and the future directions. And throughout the agenda items, I will also talk about the role of teachers and also community partners in Asia, and specifically in Hong Kong. So why service learning in Asia? So we need to ask why. Yeah. So according to our former president is Professor Eric Chan, and he is an economist. And from an economist perspective, and he thinks that there are three important elements why service learning emerged in Asia. First one is digitalization. We're talking about IT, and a lot of people, they use Twitter, Facebook, and actually, we have to think about, actually digitalization actually brings a lot of creativities. But we also need to learn how to adapt, how to learn about the IT and technology things. And then this actually gives a lot of meaning for us that we need to have lifelong education. And so what we can predict every day is change. And also what we can do is to change ourselves to accept this is, this digitalized world. And the second element is globalizations. I think every university right now, we talk about internationalizations. We talk about how we can train our young people to be a global citizens. So we need to have, coping skills with different diversity, and then we also need to understand the intercultural perspective. And this is very important for us, especially nowadays in Hong Kong educations, we also emphasize the internationalizations, these items. And the third one is the monopolitization of capitalism. And we know that, in Asia, people, they see the future market is in Asia. And so what we need to train our students, if, in a capitalist society, we hope that they can care about the society. So the importance of ethics, civility, and also social responsibility are very important nowadays in Asia. So we know why. And then, so we need to think about the need for our education reform. So for service learning, actually, as I mentioned, because of the modernization, globalization, actually we just focus on ourselves. We don't think about how we can care with others. So self-interest, a lot of young people, they think about, what they can take rather than what they can give to the society. So actually a lot of people nowadays, they lack of social concern, and then we always emphasize peace, but we also hope that our young people in the future, they also care about the society. They know what is social justice. They can also create a harmonious societies together. So we have an innovative response. We see service learning as an innovative response. And this response can train our future generations to be good leaders, to lead our society. So what they need to have, the general knowledge, we hope that our students can have adaptability. They can adapt different working environment, and then they understand about the working cultures, the community cultures, and they can have brain power. They need to have subject-related knowledge, and then they also have research skills, and they need to have creativity, intercultural perspective, and also, social responsibility. So we are talking about service learning in Asia. We always talk about, so what we should move in service learning, in service learning in Asia. So we talk about there are three key directions. The first one, we need to know that service learning is not random acts of kindness. And we need to promote advocacy, social justice for policy-related learning and community engagement. And the second point is talking about, for our service learning practitioners in Asia, we need to understand our own culture. We can create our own model of service learning in view of different education system, different welfare system, and different political environment. And the last thing is there should be more cross-cultural and international service learning program and research in Asia. And if we have this point, we need to really understand about the local culture, and then we can encourage this cross partnership. But we haven't touched on the teachers training, and we're talking a lot about the direction. So we move on to Z. So what we have, because of we know that a lot of countries in Asia, they are doing service learning. So we set up a service learning Asia network. And so what we do is to promote the common interest and network of student exchange, faculty research, curriculum development, and program evaluations. And we find that this platform is very important because service learning is quite new to Asia. And we are also, exploring the meaning of service learning. At the same time, we want to have mutual support. And sometimes doing service learning is quite alone, Yeah, and so you need to get faculty members to support. And so at least we can, in the region, we can have faculty members support to do research together. So we have this plan ideas to, promote service learning in Asia. So this is some example about service learning in Asia. So we have partner in India, Philippines. I'm not going to go one by one, but I just want to let you have a look about, what's going on in Asia. And other than that, actually, they also have program in, service learning also have program in Vietnam, Cambodia, and then Thailand, Japan. So you see, what are those institutional support and also the curriculum design, evaluation, funding source, and that actually link up to the core values of the university. So Taiwan, of course, they actually implement service learning into their education policy. And so Shantou University in China, and then, so you can imagine that there are quite a few universities in China now, they are doing service learning also. And we just recently received a grant from United Board for Christian Higher Education in China to do service learning training in Guangzhou with 10 universities. And to let them know more about what is service learning. But of course they can explore what's the meaning of service learning to them. And for us we call it service learning, but in China they call it philanthropy education. So I think different countries, they have different names. And some countries actually they use community service learning rather than service learning. So we have different definitions. So China in Yunnan University, Nankai University, and Tsinghua University, they also have service learning. And actually, like Tsinghua University, you see they partner with USA's university also. And they also receive funding from different foundations to develop service learning program. So after we have the overview of service learning in Asia, because I come from Hong Kong, Hong Kong is now part of China, but I also want to let you know about what's going on in Hong Kong. So service learning in Hong Kong, we have primary education, secondary educations, and higher educations. And so in primary educations, we have moral, civic, and national educations. We just recently think that we need to have these educations in Hong Kong. And so the secondary school educations, we have NNE, the moral, civic, national education. Other than that, we also have other learning experience. This is a lifelong learning, whole person development. And then the third one is talking about the direction of liberal arts education in different universities. And before I move on to talk about primary education, I want to tell you that this year we're going to have education reform in Hong Kong. And so we're going to have 3 years university educations to 4 years university educations in 2012 in September. And so this actually gives us opportunities to think about what we can actually do more with extra years. So for primary educations, you see here, we have a part is talking about life-wide learning experience. And this actually link up to, service learning also. But I must tell you that because it's developing and a lot of teachers, they don't even know what is service learning. they see service learning is just like a community service. And they send a group of students to go to the community to do service. And that might create service pollution. And we don't want to have this pollution in our community because our community is not ready. So I move on to talk about the secondary education. We also have a secondary school new curriculum. I think we are facing similar things, with your school also, because we keep changing our education policy. And honestly, a lot of teachers and principals, they can't follow it. And so now we have new curriculum again. And here you see that these are all core curriculum, and then they have 5 essential learning experience that include community service or service learning. And why they have this? It's because they want to create opportunities for our students to understand the need of different groups in Hong Kong. And they also want them to care about the society and become a proactive and responsible citizen. And we affirm the role and values of the students. So we hope that this could be, added values educations to our students. And so in university educations, as I mentioned, 4 years university educations. So what we do actually, last year we set up a service learning higher education network in Hong Kong. I must say that, Nilina, our network, all bottom up, not top down. We don't have a government support, but we hope that the government could aware that this kind of network is good for, a service learning practitioner and also teachers to exchange their ideas on doing service learning. So what we want to do is to share service learning experience and resources among the university in Hong Kong, and then we also spot out common challenges in institutionalized and strengthening service learning program. And what we want to do is to develop common outcome-based measurements in Hong Kong on service learning. So this is the member university that we have, and we have some roles and responsibility here also. And so, because we have this network, and because I come from Ningnan University, so I must talk about our service learning in our university. This is the overview about our university. So what we do service learning, we need to ask why again. Because our motto is education for service. That makes sense for us to do service learning. We have a 150 years history. And so, but we set up the Office of Service Learning in 2006. The reason is because we don't know about what is service learning before 2004. And because we think that service learning is just service practicum. And then we know about this idea, and then we introduce these ideas to our university, and then we think that we can build a partnership with our community. So what our role is, we also want to put our university into the community. So we have a strong partnership with our university, so with the community. So when you look at the development of our service learning, because why we have donation, the reason is we gain repetition from the community, and then they come back and they said they want to work with us together. So this is the development of service learning at my university. But I want to highlight something also, because service learning is from Western society. We are now also exploring whether we have service learning, this concept, in our Chinese history or our Chinese culture. So we are now doing a review on Confucianism. And so here we have Yan Yi Li Ji Xin is the values driven, and we hope that we can, look at something from our Chinese history. And then this actually echo to the mission. And then we also have the outcome-based measurement that is equal to the ABC model. And so I think you know about the situation in my university and also in Asia. So we go and think about, so how about the teachers' educations? Does we really talk about how we can teach the teachers how to do service learning? So I look at our education department's website, and then they have an advisory committee on teachers' education and qualifications. And they have a framework to talk about professional relationship and service. And they also encourage and expect teachers to interact with the community and also participate in education-related community service and volunteer work. But we don't talk about it explicitly in Hong Kong. And so we have teachers, they go for teachers training in primary and secondary school. But in university, educations, the teachers, they don't go for any teachers training. I think it's the same in here. And they know what to teach, But do they really know how to teach? Or they just want to replace by the computer, what Kathy mentioned about? So this is somehow we have to think about. Other than this professionalism of being a teacher, when we talk about we need to engage with our community, do our social workers, do they really interact or talk to each other? I think we don't. So we need to create a platform for them to talk to each other because we want to encourage the cross-section sector collaboration. So this is somehow we have to rethink about our role. So what we need to do, I think, in the long run, here is from my university, also the Hong Kong Self-Learning Network, or higher education self-learning network in Hong Kong, and then the SLANG group. And other than this, what we need to do, I think one thing that is very important for us to take action is to promote service learning in community education. For community education, we need to educate our teachers. We need to educate our social worker. We need to educate our corporation and also our government. I think this is very important if we want to move ahead to promote service learning in Asia. And at this moment, we don't have any guideline, we don't have any best practice. So you see, we hope that we can also create best practice in Asia. And Ningnan University, we create our menu. That menu actually is maybe just suitable for Ningnan because what we are doing, the model is different from our model. So different universities, they should have their own model, and they should have their own menu to do service learning. So that's the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, then please do ask me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ma, very much. I sure wish this was a longer session. There's so many issues that have come up. We have just a couple of minutes for maybe one or two questions. Anybody have a burning question they'd like to pose to our panelists? David.
Yeah, I have a question. Nadine, you made a comment. Nadine, you made a comment about service learning being hijacked by some other approaches, and then Carol, you commented on the different names. And one of the things I'm struck by is some of the similarities in the challenges that you are facing and the challenges that I know I'm facing here as director of our own service learning program. Our deans and some of our faculty recently have said that we need to be moving away from use of the word service. They want to use things like engaged public scholarship, social entrepreneurship, and I'm just wondering, and so in some ways I'm feeling a little hijacked. And I'm just wondering, is this a substantive issue, or is this issue of naming something we ought to just get over?
That's a good question, and I suppose the diplomatic answer would be, let's just get over it, but I'm not a diplomatic person. So, in a sense, I think that my view and the view of many of the people who work in the service learning field is, let's not conflate the issues. If this is service learning, then let's call it that. We can say that it's a form of community engagement, but we want to ensure that as a discipline, area of study, that people make the distinction between service learning and other forms of experiential learning or other forms of community engagement. So I think I speak for people in the service learning area in South Africa and saying it's not as simple as saying it's just a matter of get over it, it's just a name, move on from there. I think it's important for building the field and for clearly understanding its place in higher education, and particularly for us in teacher education, because you do have various forms of experiential learning, and we must be very clear about what it is we're talking about.
I think I have the same feeling of what Lidis mentioned about. In Hong Kong, we have a lot of people introduce social innovation, social entrepreneurship, knowledge transfer, and then community engagement, civic engagement. Honestly speaking, I feel confusion also. And so what we need to really understand is what we are now doing, the definition of service learning. And if we understand what we are now doing, and then we have to talk to the faculty members and educate them. And if they want to have another kind of form of service learning or experiential learning, I think they have to persuade the senior management to set up another center. But honestly speaking, in my university, it's a very small university. We only have 2,400 students. And I don't think our president will set up so many centers in a small university. So that's it.